Good evening. I'm Hilary Harper from 774 ABC Melbourne, ABC Radio Melbourne now. I do the Saturday program, and just to start with, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and the elders of any other communities who may be with us tonight. Thank you so much for coming tonight, because we're here to talk about death, which is still pretty rare. I hope it's changing. But that's something I guess we'll discuss tonight and in the other 3 events in this series across the year. I'm very excited to be exploring it with you tonight. It's not at all weird or creepy, trust me. And I'll be taking my cue tonight from the people on the Palliative Care Australia website. Talking about dying can be difficult, but it won't kill you. They're wacky funsters there. And to help us tonight, we've got 3 amazing women. Dr. Sarah Winch is Head of Medical Ethics, Law and Professionalism at the University of Queensland. Her latest book, The Best Death, will be on sale up the back at Metropolis Books, and she'll be signing it afterwards. And she's also a campaigner for death literacy through her charity Health Ethics Australia and projects like Death Cafes, Death Over Dinner and Wine and Die. It's very exciting that death and food are clearly so linked. Soropos became passionate about creating artistic experiences and spaces for the dying after losing her mother to cancer in 1995. And she combines design and arts experience with interactive technologies to turn palliative care environments into human rooms. And those spaces are now in the new Olivia Newton-John Cancer and Wellbeing Centre, the McCulloch House Palliative Care Unit at the Monash Medical Centre, and the Albany Community Hospice in WA. And Denise Love was a registered nurse until she realised that what she really wanted to do was support people through the experience of healing or dying or birth. So she trained in midwifery and she set up an in-home palliative care practice and then a doula service for birthing and dying. So we're going to look at the circle of life tonight, I think. I'm going to ask questions and anyone who wants to can answer, and some of them will be specific to your experience, I guess, but I'd love you to leap in. We'll have about 45 minutes of chat and then we'll have time for your questions. So hold on to that burning question and there'll be someone with a microphone towards the end who will come and see your upraised hand. Sarah, if I can start with you. You've described your husband Lincoln's death from cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to death, as a good news death story. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I guess because some of the stories that make the news about dying are really awful stories. So they died in terrible pain, they were writhing in agony, it was all really horrible. And I sort of, when I read these stories, think, well, what if you're that person out there who's just been given a catastrophic diagnosis and you read all the awful stories about what goes on in hospitals and you want to, die at home, but you're like me, you're in a single person household, you would be feeling such utter despair. So I wanted to get a good news dying story out there. It wasn't good from Lincoln's perspective. He didn't want to die and we didn't want him to die. But he did have the best death possible. And I also wanted to point out that in my experience, and I've seen lots of death as other people have on the panel, dying's not a terrible thing. It can be a peaceful thing. And I'm just not sure that message is sexy enough really and is getting out there.
Oh, you were telling us before that your publishers were trying hard to get you to remove the word death from the title of your book.
Yeah, not UQP, but University of Queensland Press. That was, but my first book was self-published, and I had a couple of publishers interested in it, and they said, no, you can't have death in the title. It won't sell. And it can't come out before Christmas. It's not a Christmas book. It's an Easter book. And I'm like, hello. We got our news just before Christmas, and I'm sure there are plenty of people out there in that situation. So when University of Queensland Press came across it and said, look, we really want to publish this, I said, you can't change the title. Death has to stay in it. And they said, okay. So maybe we've had a shift in thinking.
Is a good death the same for everyone? Are there universals about what constitutes a good death?
Absolutely not. Everybody has their own individual death. For me, everybody's expectations are totally different. Some people want to be in a hospital, unconscious, as much morphine as possible, and other people want to be at home with everybody they love around them, out under the trees maybe in the last few days. So it's really wrong of us as caregivers too to expect that anybody would want to die similarly to anybody else. So I think the thing that I do most is to listen to the person. What is it you want from this? Do you want to be in hospital cared for by the nurses and doctors? Great, let's do that really well. What else do you want to stay at home? But can your family do that for you? So helping, my role is always very much to listen and then to navigate the course of what could happen. But to me, there's no such thing as a good death. I mean, there's definitely a good death, but everybody's version is different.
And I also think that alleviating the person's fear is the best thing that you can do. That's the most important thing.
Because we
to
talk
help
a
with
lot
fear.
about pain, don't we? But we don't talk about fear so much. How would you do that?
Well, in the instance of the spaces that I create with the staff and patients and families in the hospitals, it's about sensory perception, finding ways to engage the senses either through smell, sound, image, and that kind of creates the brain waves then become more relaxed and creates less fear for everybody, not just for the patient, for the families and carers as well.
Tell us a little bit more about human rooms, Effie, because I've seen the images of a room swathed in kind of soft white curtains to soften the edges of a clinical space, and some images and sounds happening. And then there's the portable version where you've got a kind of curved frame above a bed that can be wheeled over to create a kind of immersive space. But what do people see and hear?
Well, the rooms are totally immersive, and they see screens with a range of images or videos that are created for that site specifically. They're mostly nature-based, and the sounds are derived from the biorhythms or the patterns in nature. Musicians may have improvised to the natural sounds. And also we use smell and we use texture and we use a lot of colour. So people can have very interesting reactions to the colour that you immerse them in as well. So for example, somebody who's unconscious but can still hear and can still, maybe smell, have aromatherapy experiences, they possibly could still, even though their eyes are closed, they could probably still feel colour on them, which also gives them a sensory experience.
And you've talked about, in other places, the difference between perhaps how some men and some women experience colour.
Yes. Yeah, so colour is totally subjective. Someone might feel that blue is cold, and then the next person might find it comforting because it reminds them of the sea or a special holiday that they've had. So it's very subjective.
And some of the images were very kind of Rorschach ink blot. It's like you could project things onto them. But is someone who is dying going to want to take some of that precious time out to sit in a room and hear, noises of the ocean, or are they going to want to spend that precious time with family?
Well, in the experiences that I've had, but Sarah and Denise probably have a better idea, when somebody's dying, they spend long periods of time dying, and there's a lot of anxiousness and people are sitting around waiting. So
in my experience, it can give the family time out. If I can offer them something like you're talking about, Effie, it just means that the family doesn't take full responsibility for every minute and in fact is hovering and over-caring.
Yeah.
So if I can say to a family, let's give them some space to die, let's let them go into that beautiful energy of that space, why don't you go and have a meal together? And if they die while you're gone, how beautiful, it was perfect, they wouldn't do it otherwise. And so it's really beautiful to give them that space where the family maybe comes and sits out in the room and talks to me or the nursing staff, and we talk through things while it's all happening. But I think it's different once again for everybody, but I don't think unless we try it we're even going to know it exists.
Nurses have often said to me that people will die when the family leaves because they're waiting for that to happen. I don't know if
I've heard a few stories like that. But I think it is individual. Some people don't want those things and some people do. But I think really it's about engaging with people to let them know what is available and then working with them to allow that to happen. And saying that, in Australia we have such a big range of people that can work with you at end of life.
And you've talked, Sarah, in your book about the end of life experience in terms of quality of life and in terms of beauty. And I found that a bit startling. I mean, can that period be a beautiful time?
I mean, it's interesting where that notion of quality comes from, and qualia, and knowing how you experience something yourself. And that quote where I say in the book, I like to think of quality as beauty, actually comes from Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist locked up in prisons who wrote about quality. And I love that quote because I think that it's really what's beautiful for you rather than what's beautiful for me or the family or for the caregiver or whatever. And I really like that idea, and thinking to yourself, how do I want to die? And most people do die how they've lived. So, you know, a colleague of mine has said, look, I'm just going to work. I'd just deny it. I'd turn up at work. That's the way I would deal with it. I've always worked, which is very interesting to the way other people might do it. And I think it's about holding judgment and saying, look, and working with people and allowing them to be entirely selfish for once in their life and calling the shots.
You tell a great story in your book about a young man who said, you know, that he basically illuminated the difference between pain and other forms of suffering.
Yeah. So that's a very powerful case. So that comes from, he's a physician now, but at the time I was mentoring him through one of his projects, and he said he stood at the end, he was a young doctor, and he stood at the end of the bed of this fellow who was dying from leukemia, and he said he'd been in terrible, terrible pain, and he said everything he'd learned went right out of his head, and he just said, how can I help you? And the guy said, I want to go surfing. So he was in a big Brisbane hospital, and he said, I just want to go surfing. And Richard thought, oh no, we've spent ages getting his pain right, and he wants to go surfing. Anyway, he thought, well, okay, and he explained everything to him, and he said, look, you know, when you can't stand the pain anymore, come back. And so the guy went off and he went surfing, and he came back about 7 days later, and Richard was called down to the ED, and he said it was incredible. He said he was arcing, which you see sometimes where his heels were on one side and his shoulders were on the other side. The pain was so terrible. And Richard thought, what have I done? What have I done? What have I done? And he said it took me ages even to get a line in. But when he did all of that and the guy settled down, he said, thank you. And I guess that's the best, and died shortly after, a few hours afterwards. And I guess that's it, isn't it? And when I tell that story around palliative care conferences, people say, now who thinks he should have gone? And you know, some people still will say, no, he shouldn't have gone. Or he should have had the syringe driver going out on the waves. And I said, yeah, right, you know, that's great, you know. How are we going to do that? And, you know, probably fall off and drown, get a grip. You know, it's about, you know, letting people have choices, and you will see people choose to have pain sometimes to engage more. I see it also with young mothers who want to say, I don't want to be knocked out when my kids come. And allowing clinicians to work with people and say, what is important to this person, rather than what is important to you as a clinician that you feel that you've got to do to manage the death.
Well, how much control is it possible to take now? I mean, Denise, you were talking about being able to find what suits everybody. Is that possible in today's health system?
Well, from my point of view as a non-medical, I don't work as a nurse anymore. I work as a doula. So my first question to everybody is, do you want to be awake or asleep when you die? And do you want to live or die? And when they say they want to live, we go surfing.
Yeah.
So it's my go-between between the palliative care services, and having worked within it, I'm very clear about the medical point of view. But I just think everybody has the right to live until they die, but nobody's telling them that. Mm. So, you know, I had a woman who just wanted to go sailing on a yacht for a day. We got lifters, we got everything, and we got out on the yacht for the day, and she died the next day. Mm. But the family were just so powerful and determined to get her there. But until we give people options, they have no idea they have them.
Well, and I mean, a doula service is a privately paid thing. You pay for a doula to come and help you do those things. If you're not doing that, and if you're in the public health system, how much control do you have?
Well, the other thing is, I'll just mention that I train doulas all over Australia now and have been for a long time, and part of our training is we must do 3 free deaths a year. So I can usually find a free death for anybody at any time. But look, it's not suitable for everybody either. But at the same time, if somebody contacts me and they can't afford to pay for a service, I will find it or I'll do it myself. I need and want, and I've been doing this for 28 years, I want people to have life experiences if they want them.
There's a very powerful picture going around I don't know if people have seen it, but I think this whole thing is an attitude, and it's where an ambulance has gone to a home and has been asked to pick up someone and take them to hospital to die. And as they've picked up this woman, she said, "I'd just like to see the ocean. It's in Hervey Bay." And so there's a picture of this woman on the trolley sitting up, looking out to the ocean, and the ambulance bearer beside her. And everyone's just thought, oh my God, that is just incredible. And that's about attitude. It did not take that much, a great attitude shift for the ambulance service, to pull in by the beach, and Hervey Bay is on the beach, and push this woman in her gurney up to the sand. And he said, "I would have got her out, but there was only me," says this little guy. And he said, and it's just a powerful picture of saying, there's a lot you can do. And doulas are wonderful, and all these special rooms and that, and are great. But there are small things people can do. It's about attitude.
Denise, sorry.
Can I just add that when I conduct the research to develop the content for the rooms, I talk to patients about their favourite places and spaces, and we go out and film those places so that if they can't get there, they've got the opportunity to see it in the space.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
likewise, I've been to Disneyland with a child in their sick bed, by bringing videos in and popcorn and doing the whole thing with an 8-year-old who just couldn't bear the thought of dying before they went to Disneyland. So we did Disneyland, and you can create an energetic space. It's phenomenal. But also, thank you.
Denise, can I ask you a bit more about what a death doula does? How do you train to be this thing, and what is actually involved on a day-to-day basis when you go to someone's house who's dying?
Sure. So, look, training isn't necessary. Nobody trained me. I just saw a hole in the community. If you're willing to be of service to somebody, that's a basic thing, and listen and not do. But I've set up a 2-day training course, which then follows on with an advanced training course on how to care for somebody. But if you called me this afternoon, is what often happens, and says, "Hi, I want to bring mum home from hospital. She wants to die at home," or "my 8-year-old child," and the palliative care team have told us we've only had a few days, or from first diagnosis of breast cancer, some people say, "I want you on board. I want to walk the path with you." So we go and meet in the house, and I say to the person, "So do you think you're dying?" And they go, "Oh, I don't know." The doctor said I was. And so then I clarified that. I said, "Well, do you want to live or die?" I ask really direct, quick questions, because the incredible thing about death is there's not necessarily a tomorrow. So the most information, I have the opportunity to sit and say, "Tell me what you need, tell me what you want, and tell me how you want to do it." And then I've got hundreds of doulas I've trained in Melbourne. I can ring around and find somebody that can either start that afternoon or start with you, or I'll stay with you 4 hours. But one of the most powerful things we do as a death doula, we're not often there at the death, is to go in, I find, between 4 in the... If somebody wants to come home, or even in palliative care, to go in at 4 in the afternoon and sit with a person until about midnight. That way the family can have a family dinner. I say, go out and have your dinner and sit around the table, do your veggies together and sit and talk about how we're doing. What's going on here? Have you thought about talking about the funeral? Have you talked about this? And if I go in every evening for 3 or 4 afternoons, I say, I want you to all go to bed at 8 o'clock. And around 12, I sneak out of the house, or I go and wake them up and they come and lie with a dying person, even if it's in a palliative care service or in a hospital. But that 4 hours for families sit together without any responsibility in their exhaustion and facing death. And I say, go and talk about death. Oh, really? I said, let's get our head around it. We've got a minute or a day or a week or a month. I don't know, but this person's terminally ill. So I do that. Sometimes I sleep in for 24 hours. Sometimes I go just in the morning and take the children to school and come back and help shower. The biggest thing I do is end-of-life directives. So on the day I go in, I give to the children, to the adults, everybody a piece of paper and say, what do you want to happen to you when you're dying? So it's kind of just that open, incredibly honest conversation. And that comes from me from years of being a nurse. I've been a nurse for 50 years and now choose to work as a doula, not as a nurse, because I don't have any laws that tell me what I can do and what I can't do. There's no protocols and no practices. It's
interesting how you said when you die, because it sounds like a lot of people, when they're talking to doctors and when they're talking to each other, use phrases like, if I get really sick, if I'm close to death, I don't want blah, blah, blah. It's like, this is going to happen. Is there a problem with the language that gets used around death and dying, either in hospitals or in families?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I like people to use the D word, death and dying, and I like we still have cases where people will turn up in the emergency department and they are full of cancer and they are clearly at end of life, and no one along the line has told them that. And so we'll track back and say, well, hang on a minute, this person's been seen by this group and this team and this team and this team. Did you not speak about this? And, oh, well, yeah, we did. And I'm thinking, well, did you say, this is likely to kill you? You will be dead in so many, and we don't really know. And that's when we say, oh, but we don't know. And I said, no, we don't know exactly time-wise, but we do know that not many people survive this after X, Y, and Z. So we can say things very clearly to people. And I think that that's a constant message that we have to get out there, particularly, I think, to doctors, because people like to hear it from the doctor first. They like to have that sort of credibility, I think. I think nurses are much better at delivering the news, but I do think public generally want to hear it from that person. So they can't sort of slide out of it. And we do, we teach it and we examine it and all of those things. But there is a lot of slippage, I think, when they get out into the big world.
And your charity pushes for what you call compassion awareness amongst clinicians.
Yeah,
where does the compassion blinkers come from?
So one of the things I did notice when Lincoln was dying was that some of the staff did not seem very compassionate. And I can understand that, and it's your day job and you get a bit fed up with things. And so we developed something called the Compassion Cafe, and I run that for staff. And we actually talk about all the things that drain our compassion as healthcare workers, and how we need to work on self-compassion to build it back up, and how we need to say, what's our, when we've had enough of things, how we need to have an escape plan. And I will often say to people, what is your escape plan? You can't be, I find it very difficult that people might want to work in one really high demand, particularly first responders. That's a very high demand area. So, how are we treating our workers? And how do we, say to them, look, do you need a break now? Are you taking all your annual leave? We've had a couple of really critical cases that I've known about where we should have intervened earlier and said to the clinician, hey, you're not travelling really well. We really appreciate everything you've done. Let's do X, Y, and Z. So we're getting more of an awareness about that. And the Compassion Cafe, I've actually done it all over the place now. So it works really well with clinicians to just think about, you give out so much, what about you? How about thinking about yourself? Because then that helps them to continue to care.
And Denise, I'm wondering if the same thing is true for doulas. I mean, you're basically the repository of all the family's anxiety and fear. We've got to this stage where we now pay someone to come to our houses to help us deal with this basic human event. How do you cope with that as carers?
Well, I think, unlike doctors and nurses, we don't have to back up that afternoon to the next round of the next group. So my recommendation is people are only caring for 2 people at a time in a month. I've certainly cared for a lot more, but we have that, we can time ourselves. And, if you have a particularly involved, long, maybe 18-month journey with somebody, you might take 4 months off, and that's my suggestion before you pick up the next one. But we're really big on self-care that probably as a nurse I wasn't taught. And debriefing and group work.
But even if you think about resuscitation, in hospitals, CPR resuscitation is generally a failed procedure. About 75% of them don't work. And so after a resuscitation, a colleague was saying to me, the nurses go off for a debrief and the doctors go off for the next patient. And he said to me, I stand there longingly looking at the nurses.
Yeah.
Can I come? And I said, well, why don't you go? And he said, I can't go. He said, I can't go. And so trying to break down those barriers to say, you're people, you're human. It's horrible when a resuscitation fails, and yet you might do 2 failed resuscitations in one day. On to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. So trying to get them to balance that.
And that's a big difference for us. We can take, and that's why I love doing birth and death at the same time.
Yeah.
But I often run off and have I use acupuncture often to energetically change what's going on for me if I'm exhausted. But I do get the input from the other end, which is very special. But not everybody gets that.
That's beautiful.
But really time out. It has to be time out. So we can't honour the public the next time. If you go in with your pain from the last and the exhaustion, I can't be that doula I could be. So that's the difference from when I was a nurse, when I just had to back up no matter what.
And if you've had the experience of being a family member supporting someone who's going through that process of dying, what was it like back then for you, and do you feel that things are changing?
Things have definitely changed, yeah. Because when my mother was dying, it was the mid-90s, and we were talking earlier about how there was not even palliative care at that time. But it was a very confusing and chaotic experience being in the hospital at that time, because the things that I noticed were it was overheated, it was noisy, it was crowded, the lights were really bright. The nurses would come in and obviously to ease my mother's ending, to give her morphine, and it just seemed really bizarre.
They'd wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning to see if you're in pain and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's kind of what led me to start doing what I'm doing now. Yeah.
And I mean, you're an arts and culture worker who works in a hospital environment, which is a strange thing anyway. How receptive are you finding the hospital environments and the broader kind of funding situation to your work?
There was the very first space that I made ended up being a 4-year residency, artist in residency, which was funded by a combination of the hospital, philanthropic funding and arts funding. And it was a very unique position to be in, I think, because it was at the very beginning of the whole, what we call now, arts and health movement, which has been happening over the last few years. And I was very fortunate to be in that position. And I was also very fortunate to be able to be around people, vulnerable people who welcomed me in to talk and experience the work that I was creating with them. The very first space that I made, I won't tell you where it is, the nurses dubbed it the disco room. So I had a bit of a culture to overcome. There was a culture kind of barrier, I guess. But things have changed now, because when you go into hospitals now, particularly in cancer care, aged care and mental health, you see more music therapists, art therapists, allied therapists who are working across different types of therapeutic and art forms. So it is a growing area. Yeah.
Are they throwing money at you now and saying, please come and transform our hospital?
Not yet. I'm working towards that, yeah.
If anybody has $1 million.
That's right.
Can
Please speak to me afterwards.
Can I just share that when I set up my first palliative care space within a hospital, and I won't tell you what hospital that is either, they went and got panda bears and put them around because I was pandering to the patients. It was called pandering to dying people. So, look, I'm a nurse and I love it, and it's taken me all over the world, and I'm still nursing in other countries. But, institutions have got a lot to answer for our behaviours and the way we treat people. And I apologise to everybody. I've participated, no doubt, without realising.
Well, and if I was interested to read that you originally wanted to create spaces for people to die in, but you met quite a lot of pushback from the system there.
Yes. Funnily enough, when I was very young, I watched a film called Soylent Green, and my brother and I watched it together. And there was this scene where the lead character had to go into this room and lie down and look at images of nature, and listen to beautiful music, and to die, because in this film everybody had to die at a certain age. And I turned to my brother and I said, that's a really good idea. And it kind of never left me. So what I do is a much more multi-layered version of the Soylent Green idea.
But people said, actually, we're not ready to make that a space where people die. We would be more comfortable if they died with the beeping machines.
Yes. So All the rooms that I've made have been set up in such a way that a patient bed can go in there with the oxygen outlet and the nurse call button, in case of emergency. But it's really only one of the rooms that is being used as a room for people to die in, and that is actually in a community hospice in country Western Australia.
Wow. And that's a permanent space, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 I'm wondering, perhaps Denise and Sarah can speak to this. Is it possible to have a spiritual dimension of this process of dying in a largely secular public health system?
I would say absolutely. Absolutely. If the family and the friends and the nursing staff are extraordinary, and the doctors as well. I mean, we're generalising across the path. Most nurses and doctors just want to get involved and see the alternatives. They just don't think about them always. But if you energetically bring things in, I find mostly if you're respectful of the space you're going into, and you're respectful of the jobs that need to be done in that space, then there's usually not a problem for us creating whatever we need and want for the person.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there's any problem. I would be saying to dying people and their families, speak up about what you want. Be prepared to communicate rather than just saying, I'm going to leave it all to chance. Don't hand your good death over to the medical profession. I think they're wonderful, and I've been training doctors for a long time and I've got a lot of time for them. But, I guess it's a bit of a buzzword. You really do need to co-create. You really do need to say, these are my spiritual beliefs, these are important to me, or these are my cultural beliefs. I would like this to happen. And I think if it's out there and on the table, I would be thinking that there wouldn't be too many impediments. If there are, then there are ways to escalate to and it's not what you feel like doing at end of life, but I always think you need a few feisty friends, and I have a few. And feel sorry actually for the people giving me around when I die, my feisty friends who have volunteered. And I'm a feisty friend, and sometimes I've done it by phone. And so supporting people to just get those changes that they would like. And what are the ways we can do it? We've mentioned these things and nothing's happening. Well, okay, have you tried this? And I think those sort of techniques, people just get the first no and go, oh, okay, no, well, no. No, there are more you can do.
And there's that statistic of, 70% of us say that we want to die not in a hospital, but only about 14% of us actually get that choice. Is that a problem, or is that something that's a problem with the system, or that we just change our minds somewhere along the way?
I actually don't see it as a problem. So I think there are reasons why we don't die at home. It can take a lot of work. We have smaller families, we have dispersed families, and then we have about 25% of households who are single-person households. So I think there are very good reasons why we might be cared for at home, and then we reach a point where we might go in for the last few days. And I have no particular issue with that, as long as we've sort of mapped out what we'd like to do and how things are going to happen. I would like to see more hospices in Australia. We're not strong on the hospice movement, and I really would like to see a lot more of that. But I think that sometimes I worry about the push to die at home is an economic one, and that carers, family member then become carers. And so, you might be laying there at end of life and your daughter's worrying about, do I have to give her more morphine, or what do I do at this point with the dressing, or she's gasping for breath, what do I do, rather than being a daughter. And so I was able, I wanted to be a wife to my husband at end of life. Sometimes I had to switch into other mode, but generally I just wanted to sit there and not have to worry about everything else and just be in the moment. And I think if you're caring at home, it can be fabulous, and I've seen some great deaths at home. I've seen some less than great deaths at home, and I've seen some great deaths in hospital, and I've seen some less great deaths in hospitals. So I think it's about communication. Location's not a big thing for me.
What about you, Denise?
It takes a community to die at home, there's no doubt. And so that's another job, just within even a 4-hour visit to somebody's house, I can activate. I sit with a little black book and all the family and friends and friends of the family and friends of everybody, and make a roster and get it going. Look, it's incredibly challenging, and at the moment, within the movement that I'm in, people have managed to stay at home until the last 4 days, But it would be better to go to a hospice and come home for the last 4 days. It's going the wrong way round. If you truly want to die at home, I say to the family all the time, you're tired, you're exhausted, let's go to hospice now. I think you've got a little bit of time. Let's get a week of rest. And, I mean, the palliative care team think I've gone mad, but let's get a week of rest and get the family, get the bed down to the lounge room and get what we need in the house set up. That's if you've got time. I mean, many families I walk into have had a diagnosis and it's all over in 6 weeks and it's all just finished. So it really depends on time. There is definitely a movement towards home death because of money.
That does concern me. And also you look at things like... my husband didn't want our 11-year-old daughter there when he died. He thought that was quite traumatic for her. And she'd said to me just a few years ago, I'm so glad Dad didn't die at home. And I said, well, why is that? Because I was quite happy for him to die at home. I'd managed lots of deaths at home. And she said, I was worried about how we'd get the body out. And she said, I wouldn't have liked that. And she said, I'm really glad that happened. So, sometimes there are some really interesting ways that can play out. I am concerned that it is a financial thing to move people because we've seen that deinstitutionalisation of care, we've seen it in mental health, we've seen it in residential aged care, and now people are saying, this is costing a lot of money. Well...
And they're not providing the palliative care teams to go to the community.
No.
So they're saying everybody can die at home, but where's the team? Because no matter what work we're doing, we often need to work in collaboration with the palliative care because we don't manage pain. Having said that, because I've worked at both ends and because I'm a bit of an expert in pain through birth and all sorts of things and worked with cancer patients a lot, I find there's 1,000 other ways of working with pain. So if you set up your environment and I look deeply into somebody's eyes that's got incredible and pain, and you're saying to me you want to be awake, well, you're just going to have to do your pain. So with breath work and other things, we can manage pain much differently now that I don't have a morphine syringe in my hand. And that's me as a nurse being given a power of a different sort. If I don't have the palliative care team strength in my hands, I've got to find something deep inside myself to help people through their situations. And I'm shocked and amazed at how powerful a family sitting beside somebody reading a script of relaxation to somebody in incredible pain can be. So that's exactly why I don't work in the medical system now. I want to find those ways. If our movement is towards home death, and we're going to have to do it, and palliative care teams don't come out at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're in pain, we've got to do it right. Let's not keep our people at home to die if we don't have the tools to do it.
A friend of mine's wife died last year after quite a long illness with cancer, and he said he felt incredibly lucky because he knew someone who knew how to care for a body after death, and she came every day and helped them wash the body and helped them care for the body so that they could keep her at home for 3 days.
And that's what we do.
But it's really interesting because no one wanted to talk to him about how you keep a body cool, how you keep a body healthy and safe in a house. And when he rang the funeral service and said, I've just found out it's illegal for me to carry this body in my car, I just need the car, can you do that? They went, well, you can sign up to the basic package or the deluxe package. And he said, no, I just want the car. It was this long process.
And you know what, you can take them in the car as long as you've got the doctor's death certificate with you.
Well, and this knowledge, I think, is we're very distant from it. How do we claw that back, or are we just not really interested in getting that back?
Well, no, and that's the doula movement. We're doing green funerals. You don't need a coffin. You don't need to even engage a funeral parlour. There's no legal... There's no legal reason why you ever have to ring a funeral parlour. So I'm starting to do workshops for the community as well as training doulas where I can show you how to wrap somebody in a sheet, how to manage them at the crematorium, how to put them in the back of your ute if that's what you've got. I've got a palliative care friend who went and got a surfboard to put in the back of a trailer to put her father on. She's a palliative care nurse to take him to the cemetery because nobody would come and get his body without charging hundreds of dollars. We're all being... look, I could talk about this forever and that's another conversation. But it needs to cost you nothing except crematorium fees and funeral fees if you've got the courage. You've got to have a lot of courage.
Well, I mean, is it a problem if the funeral industry makes money out of our ignorance and squeamishness? Because there are things that I would not be comfortable doing. I have small children,
Which is fine. Difficult. And thank goodness for them. So I've got 3 or 4 that I work with in Melbourne constantly where I ring and say, we do need the car, we need this, but we don't need that. Would you do that? And they're delighted to see community taking care of their loved people that they care about. But you need to know you have a choice. And so I'm always happy to answer questions about choices. You know, it's a beginning of a new phase where I've investigated the funeral services in Australia for the last 2 years, and I know absolutely everything, and I work in collaboration with two of the biggest in Melbourne. So it's the truth. But once again, it's also fine if you just want to ring them up and walk away. It doesn't matter. It's your individual choice.
You were nodding when we were talking about hospice before and saying, yes, there should be more of that. Can you tell us a bit about your experience and why that's an important thing for you?
Well, it ties in with what Denise is just saying too about the community. The hospice experience that I've had is with a community-run hospice who went from, when I worked with them, they went from having like an old house that they'd converted into a hospice. It had been donated by the Catholic Church, I think, in 20 years before, and they needed a new hospice. They wanted to increase their bed size to 8 beds, but the health department made them jump through hoops in order to be able to build a new hospice to increase the bed size from 6 to 8 beds, I think it was. But I just found that whole experience working with them so much more rewarding in terms of, because they were all about creating a home environment and allowing the people who were the families and the carers of the person who was at the hospice, whether it be a child or an older person or whoever it was, allowing them to basically be there and make it their home, because it was in a country area and a lot of the people who came to the hospice came from farms, and they wanted to go to the hospice at the end of their life rather than die on the farm. So, and this also included Indigenous families, so it was a broad range of diverse people from diverse communities. And so I just found that it was a really caring and really loving place. And I was very impressed with the volunteer program as well. So lots of people from the community would come every day, either just to sit with people, like, you know, do the doula process, or to, you know, and I had a lot of respect for them because they really embraced the Human Room project. And I trained, you know, I was training people who had never used an iPad or an app before as to how to run the space, and they really, you know, they've taken it over, and it's like it's their room now. They've embraced it and they own it. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it, how you can show people a new kind of normal way to function, even if it's about something as terrifying as death, and people will take it on board and go, actually, that's really useful.
It's interesting how we don't question tradition. But I think what I want to share is that I'm only using tradition that I learned from the Aboriginal people in Australia when I was 20, and I'm living in Cambodia and Nepal, where it's still done exactly as we used to do it, or our great-great-grandparents did it. And what happened post-war was the funeral industry took it over, and the nursing staff and hospitals have got fear-based. But just briefly on that house thing, so Gary and I have just bought a house in Hepburn Springs, and we'd like to run an Airbnb practice where you can rent your room to come and die. And there's nothing to stop it. So we've bought the ideal house as the death house, because once a family rang me and said, look, we all live interstate. Mum lives in a tiny place in inner city, and we'd like to come and be with her while she's dying, and it's not going to be long. Do you know of anywhere we can go? And I said, oh, my place sounds good. And I do Airbnb anyway, but more and more of us looking now. I would love to buy every old motel in Australia and have them up as death rooms, $35 a night. Look, there's lots of ways of doing this, and trust me, there's some incredible people around Australia. We're thinking, us baby boomers don't want to do the normal thing, number one. We'd like combi vans as hearses, and we're thinking really broadly about how to do this with fun and with respect. You know, and so that it's not hard for the family and the community can help. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm loving every aspect of this conversation, but I'm aware that we need to leave some time for questions. And I want to finish up with a discussion about death literacy, because this is something that I think you're all pushing for. But I'm wondering what it would look like. What would the wonderful society look like where we could talk freely about death? Compulsory classes in schools? What?
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, the schools are so overloaded, aren't they? So, I mean, I think getting basic information out there is really, really important. Even people knowing that death doulas exist, or that palliative care exists, or what does palliative care mean. Just getting people thinking about their options, just getting people remembering that we're all going to die. And so, a little bit of self-interest can be quite motivating. And then just getting people around thinking about what their options truly are. And I think that to me is helpful.
I was struck by one of the reactions someone had to Lincoln's diagnosis. Why didn't Sarah pick it up? She's a nurse, which is an unbelievable reaction to have reported to you.
Don't worry, Sarah thought about that as well. Look, it was incredible. We just put it down to his fitness. When I looked at it, I was just like, whoa, I couldn't believe it. So,
and that really, I think that speaks to the difficulty people have in believing in the whole concept of death, their own, other people's. I don't want to deal with
I think
this.
too, we've still got a sense of some death is fair and some death is unfair. And if you're fairly fit and you're a nice person and you've looked after yourself, well, then you certainly don't get full of cancer and die at, 48. That happens to that person who's been smoking and wild and mean and nasty. And, that whole sense of deserved death and undeserved death. And yes, we will get there. We'll die one day, but we're basically good people and we can figure things out. So I think that the unfairness of life really comes at you quite... an unpredictability of life. There is so much we can control and there is so much we can't. Makes you think, it could be me. And as a friend of mine was saying, well, look, he was saying, I'm really upset that I've got this. And I thought, why me? And then he said, because he's been a good person too, this guy, and done all these amazing things and devoted his life to medicine. And then he said to me, I thought, why not me? And I thought, exactly.
Yeah.
It's going to happen to all of us one day. Why not me?
Denise, what's your vision of a death-literate world?
Just the word dead and death is such a horrible word in the world still. But the death, sorry, I'm a bit blank. What was the question? I was so wrapped up in what you were saying.
Sorry,
What's your
What do
vision
you
of
mean?
a death-literate world?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking. So death-literate world for me is where it's no longer a dirty word. And to say, did your mother die or is she still alive? When did your father die? What did your father die of? Nobody asks direct questions. It's always this, how are you? Does that mean a husband died? It's I'm so harsh. And the reason it comes to me is I was 8 when my mother died. And my father came home from the hospital. I didn't even realise she was that sick or dying. I hadn't seen her for ages. And he came into the house and he told me that my mother had passed away. And I thought, I wonder what that means. So I sent to my room and I could hear everybody crying. And it took hours and hours, and I was sitting in my room thinking, I wonder if that means she's dead. And I wanted to hear that word, not she's dying, but she's dead. It's a beautiful final word. And yet when I use it in the community, people go, it's so final. I said, well, which death isn't? It's really, I'm passionate about it because I was the child who didn't understand the terminology. And can I just say one more thing about death literacy? Not every dead person sits on a star and looks down on you and looks after you. I used to be sort of up there running my life as a child thinking, you bitch, where are you, I need you right now. So our literacy around death has to be really, really clear. You're alive, you're dead, do you want to live, do you want to die? When I say to people, what has the doctor told you? Oh, they sort of said I've got about 8 months or 8 weeks or 8 days. And I say, to what? And they still aren't saying the word. I said, do you think you're dying? And the daughter bursts into tears and drags mum outside. And I said, no, come back. That's what we're here to talk about. So if you're brave enough to ever invite me into your house, be ready for it.
Effie, what about you?
Well, I've been sitting here thinking, now what am I going to say to answer this question? I guess the only thing that I can say is that, there was a point in time in my life where I felt like we needed to start talking about it more and being more accepting of it. And I feel that is happening now. So, I think things are changing quite quickly. Yeah.
And in terms of the spaces where people die, what would be a great situation where people were comfortable making those good spaces?
Well, One day I hope to be able to invent, I guess we could look at the way that augmented reality is going. If you want to be in a cocktail bar with your friends having cocktails when you're dying, or if you want to be in a forest, or, there's people can choose. Possibly in the future people will be able to choose, but not everybody gets to choose, you never know what's going to happen, so, yeah.
I was struck by the idea that you would just keep doing what you ordinarily do. So I would be in a rainforest with a cocktail bar and a paperback would just collapse onto my face. Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah, Denise and Effie. It's been a fascinating discussion. Let's have some questions. We've got about 10 minutes until the bell goes and a microphone will come and get you if you raise your hand.
Your
Hi.
Conversation went a little bit differently than I expected it to, but I just wanted to reference Petria King, who's done a lot of work in this area in Australia for, 30 years or so. But I was interested in her comments, which was that one of the things she kept saying was that death is not failure, and that the manner of death, where you have a good death or a bad death, is really about processing a lot of the feelings that come up when death is on the horizon. So dealing with grief and anger and pain and those kind of things. So.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I don't need to respond to that. I can't think of a response. It's positive.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable comment. I'm aware of Petria's work. Yeah, she's excellent.
A celebrant rang our radio program the other day and we were talking about funerals of the future, and she said, there's got to be a space for sadness. You've got to allow for mourning. It's great to celebrate a life, but you have to allow people to grieve as well, and that struck a chord with me. I think we've got another question up the back.
I would really be interested to find out where the death cafes are. I know they've started in the UK, but I haven't found out about them over here.
So I can talk to that. So Death Cafe is an international movement. Actually started in Switzerland and was popularised from the UK. And so they've got a website and you can run your own because they're free-form community conversation about death and dying. So we ran quite a few in Brisbane. They've been running here in Melbourne. So if you want to run one, they're very straightforward. There's no right or wrong, a bit of respectful communication. And then there's also things along a similar version, Death Over Dinner, which is a lot more structured, that comes out of the USA. And then our version, Wine and Die, which is, with a nice glass of wine, sitting around talking, and it's a version of Death Cafe. But Death Cafe has got some caveats around it now. They've got some rules around it where they like you to follow, but it's still a great initiative. And people really enjoy them. I've run so many different death cafes now. Everyone's different and different things come out.
Keep your hand up if you've got a question. The mics are roving.
I'm 86, so death is fairly close for me. I was in a shop the other day and I bought a pair of socks. The woman said to me, they've got a 25-year guarantee. And I said, I don't think I'll be around to catch that. And she was shocked. She was absolutely shocked that I should take that attitude. However, I want to say there was a lot more dying around when I was young. And at least twice a year, as a child, I went to wakes where the body was in the front room. People said prayers in with the body, and out in the kitchen there was wine and beer and cakes and so on going on. And death was very much part of the life I grew up in. I think people have become so expect that the medical profession can stop them from dying is part of the reason they're not wanting to die. But in my age group, a lot of us really feel we are worried about being kept alive when we really feel we've had a good innings, it's time to go, and we'd like to be allowed to choose to go.
So advanced directives as of next year, advanced directives is going to be in every hospital. When you're admitted to hospital, there's sort of legal parameters being put around that. But the reality is a lot of us drop dead on the street or somewhere else. But I would love to talk to you more, and you're welcome to contact me and I'll come and sit with you and do an advanced directive that's pretty watertight. Good girl. Fantastic. But that's what we all need to do, is to put down on paper now, whether you're 16, 17 or 18, what you think you might like when you're ready to die. Have the courage to do it. It took me about 2.5 weeks, because every time you sit with it, it's very confronting. But until you have that conversation with yourself, how are you going to have it with medical staff and other people?
The other thing is the forms are different for every state. So for people who may be listening to this later on, check the forms that are legal in your state, and you can do that by the Alzheimer's Australia or now the Dementia Australia website, because everyone with dementia is going to eventually lose capacity. And make sure your family know where it is, and make sure your family present it. So we have had cases where people have filled it out and families have thought, I can't let mum or dad go, and not presented it. And recently a student said to me, Sarah, I was out on prac and guess what? There was an advanced health directive. It was on file, but the family was saying, look, we want everything done to an elderly person. However, the advanced health directive trumps family directions in Queensland, and he found it, produced it, and the treatment stopped. Well done, student. I was very, very, very proud ethics teacher at that moment in time. Because so sometimes it's not straightforward. You have to get all your family on board so that in the moment they're all going to say yes, because in my experience with doctors particularly, if the family agree to stop treatment, that's great. Nobody is going to hassle over it. However, if one person comes screaming in, generally it's the stockbroker from New York, comes screaming in, and they haven't been around saying, oh, you can't do everything, but everything stops.
I was reading one intensive care doctor who was saying, if necessary, say something like, if you love me, you will follow these instructions. So you may not wish to emotionally blackmail your children, but the option is there.
Don't fill them out in secret. Do not fill them out in secret.
Fill them out with your family
and explain it all and get them all on board, because, when you lose that capacity to make decisions, that document is so important, and it's really important that your family back you 100%.
And do blackmail your family. Tell it, right, if you love me, you'll do this.
Whatever it takes. Who's got the microphone now?
On social media, something that I've seen as a young person quite frequently is when someone passes away unexpectedly, there's a lot of romanticism around people who don't know them very well. A lot of people post and talk about it. How is it with close family when a person who perhaps doesn't have very good traits passes? Do you see a lot more honesty about that person, or is it generally quite romanticised again?
Well, I absolutely encourage honesty, even if we have a closed room conversation. So for me, after somebody's died, and hopefully I've got to know the family a little bit, but maybe I'm called in afterwards, I say, let's have the truth gathering. Let's sit together in the dining room. Maybe you need a scotch or a wine, but let's sit and tell me what your dad was really like. Sit and tell me what your sister was really like, because you can feel in families when there's tension around it. And I find such a powerful space to allow them maybe 2 days before we even think about the funeral to tell me really what mum and dad were like. But the other terrible thing is when you go to a funeral where one of your family members has been pretty awful for whatever reason, and everybody else has the romantic, oh, your dad was so wonderful. I remember when we fell off the bar, stools at the bar together, and he bashed me, It's terrible stuff. But, there's no truth. No, there's no truth unless you open the door and say, tell me what the worst thing about your dad was. Tell me what the most beautiful thing about your dad was. Tell me about your brother. But now everybody's got rose. The second they take their last breath, the rose-coloured glasses go on.
They become canonised quite quickly, but in my experience that wears off. And, but immediately I'm a great believer in not speaking ill of the dead, particularly. If I have an argument with somebody or someone's been particularly egregious and they die, then the argument dies with them. To me, you sort it out while they're alive. Once they're dead, there's no need to add to it. That's my personal view. I don't think you need to be completely effusive either, but I think I take care, and I'm talking to a friend who's writing a very powerful book about his mother who's currently dying. And I said, you be careful what you write in that book. She's got no right of reply. And he said, oh, thanks for pulling me up on that, and I'll get my brother to read it. I said, great. You know, his mother's a good friend of mine. I said, you just be careful, because once you publish a book, it's out there and people can read it.
Time for one more question, I reckon.
I'm part of the advocacy movement for doing death differently, and I often ask myself the question you asked, what is death literacy? And I contribute to it by running death cafes in Melbourne seasonally, but I also used to be a literacy teacher. And when I reflect on that, almost no one became literate. What they became was extremely resourceful and very, very courageous. And that was what enabled them to work within our society that relies so heavily on texts. And I feel it's the same with death. And I just really want to commend the speakers and Denise's fabulous humour. You know, it is that courage and resourcefulness, I feel, that is going to enable people to do it differently.
And I do hope that's true. Look, thank you so much all for coming tonight and being part of this process. There will be 3 more events in this series. Topics still being nutted out, but I think we should probably have a look at grief. What do you reckon? Yeah. Thank you so much for coming along tonight and being part of this. Please give them a really big hand.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.